Good Friday morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Susan Duffy. I'm serving as chair of the Kansas Corporation Commission. And with me today are Commissioners Keene and Commissioner French. And this is the third in a series of workshops on resource adequacy. The other two have been extremely beneficial and helpful as we better understand and navigate the issues surrounding resource adequacy for us here in Kansas, as well as the SPP. And guess what? We have the SPP here today. So we also have a host of other people. Herb is being represented, staff. And so we hope we have a good, robust discussion. With me today from SPP is Casey Cathy, Director of Grid Asset Utilization, and CJ Brown, Director of Operations. And we've seen their faces before and heard from them often. Our Master of Ceremonies, I'm going to turn this over to Director of Utilities, Jeff McClanahan. And Jeff, I know it's been a long week, and this is a good way to finish it off. So thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you, Commissioner Duffy. Let me make some introductions here, and then we'll get down to it. So joining us today from staff is Justin Grady, who is our Chief of Revenue Requirement, Class Cost of Service and Finance, and Leo Hanos, our Chief Engineer, who is also head of our energy operations and pipeline safety sections. Also joining us today is Herb. So David, would you like to introduce your members that are with us today?
Yes, thank you, Jeff. My name is Dave Nickel. I'm Consumer Counsel with CURB, and I have with me attorneys Todd Love and Joseph A. Strab, and our analysts Patrick Orr and Josh Franz. Thank you.
With that, let me introduce Southwest Power Pool. SPP is a nonprofit regional transmission organization. It's mandated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to ensure reliable supplies of power, adequate transmission infrastructure, and competitive wholesale electricity prices on behalf of its members. A particular interest to us in this work study series is SPP's role as a balancing authority. So in that role, SPP balances electric supply and demand in order to ensure there is sufficient generation to meet demand for electricity. And by consolidating its 14 state members into a single balancing authority region, they can leverage their diverse fleet of hundreds of generating units to serve load under varying conditions across the SPP footprint. So with that, let me turn it over to Ben. Are you the correct person to turn it over to, or who am I? Should I turn it over to for introductions and to get it started?
Hi, this is Kim O'Gwen, and I'm the current Director of State Regulatory Policy. So I'll get us started and then pass it over to our presenters. And so good morning, Chair Duffy, Commissioner Keene, and Commissioner French. As I said, I'm Kim O'Gwen. I'm very familiar with you all commissioners, so it's great to see you all this morning. I'm, as I said, the Director of the State Regulatory Policy with SPP, and we're certainly appreciative of this opportunity to come before you and make this presentation on resource adequacy. Before we begin our presentation, I definitely want to acknowledge President French, who is leading our Regional State Committee, and also has provided leadership in the newly created group, the Resource and Energy Adequacy Leadership Team. And also, I would like to acknowledge Sherry Albrecht, who was the former RSC president and now is chairing the Cost Allocation Working Group. You both are held in certainly high esteem in SPP. You're extremely valued. And we thank you so much for your leadership and your input in ensuring that SPP is operating reliably. So thank you for all your efforts that both of you have contributed thus far. And so with that, I'll turn it over to our two presenters. We have with us today Casey Cathy, who is the Director of Grid Utilization Assets, and also with us CJ Brown, who is the Director of Operations. Casey, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Do we have a presentation or should I share? How does that?
You are welcome to share that. I have
Okay.
not received it, so.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. Let me see. Just bear with me for a moment.
Casey, if you want me to pull it up, I can share my screen if that would be helpful to you.
I think I have it. Let's see if I can do this.
Okay.
I might need to remove my external monitor so it's sharing correctly.
There, we see it. That's good.
Okay.
But it's also got the working view. There we go.
Okay, let's see.
There we go.
Does that work?
Yes.
Okay, let's get started. So, yeah, I appreciate the intro, Kim. So, we have a couple of slides just to kind of bring everybody up to speed on SPP, and we always like to start with a little bit of a visual. So, this is our current footprint. Southwest Power Pool as the regional transmission organization. Our primary functions as the RTO are in the red. So we go all the way from New Mexico, parts of Louisiana and Texas, all the way up to Saskatchewan Power. So we actually have a tie with Canada. We have both HVDC lines with ERCOT, so Texas. And then we also have 7 HVDC ties with the Western interconnection. So they operate on 60 hertz, but on a different interconnection. And as you can see, there's a number of efforts that we are providing in the West. Our yellow is the reliability coordination. So we are providing a NERC function as the RC for the yellow footprint. The hashed blue is our Western Energy Imbalance Service. So we run a real-time market for those utilities. And something that's kind of interesting and quite novel is the Western Resource Adequacy Program. So a number of topics this morning will be about resource adequacy, and something that is kind of a general hot topic for the industry, not only Kansas, not only SPP as the RTO, but across the world. Is resource adequacy. Everyone is struggling with transitioning into renewables and providing economic and reliable supply across extreme conditions, recognizing there's pros and cons to various fuel types. And the orange, I guess that peach color is SPP on a contract service working with Western Power Pool and 26 utilities in the West, all the way up to British Columbia, Seattle, down to Arizona Public Service to provide a resource adequacy program. And I say it's quite novel because that's an area that traditionally has been folded into either load responsible entities or RTOs. And this is kind of its own tariff to provide a pooling of resources because they are also struggling with how best to reliably transition and move generation fleet changes over the years. So we're excited to be able to provide that service. Let's see if we can go. And just from a question perspective, I want to make sure this is quite valuable. So I don't know if we want to manage it through chat or you guys stop me. Okay, so this is our strategy. We SPP has put together quite a robust strategic plan, doing due diligence based on where we're heading. I'm not going to read you all of these things, but I did want to highlight a few things down below. In our strategic opportunities and enabling capabilities, we are making concerted efforts to innovate transmission planning, innovate cost allocation, and optimize steams, as well as what I mentioned with the Western expansion. The grid of the future is something that's very similar to what we're going to talk about today. and moving towards resource adequacy and where the future of the grid is moving towards in 20 years, 30 years timeframe, and making sure that we're making the right policy changes and incentivizing the right behaviors to be able to reliably transition into what we're seeing on the grid. So this is a typical statistic that most people are curious about, is the generation interconnection queue. This actually refreshes and pretty much twice a week. So it seems like every time we put together a PowerPoint with the generation interconnection queue, it's already kind of old by the time we present it. It's a very active queue. As you can see, there's a few things to note here. So we peak at just over 53 gigawatts as a region. I think our low load, and CJ may have the exact number, it's roughly 22 gigawatts. And so when you look at what's actually in the queue to be built, we're about double our peak and about 5 times our valley minimum load value in the queue itself. Some other things to note is there's very little conventionals. We do have some 21 requests for 4 gigs of conventional thermal resources, but most of the queue is renewables, which really comes to no surprise based on the history of what we've seen over the last 80 years or so. But another thing to note is the wind. So wind has been really the big frontier for SPP over the last decade. One data point that we like to say is you kind of look at the history of wind built in SPP, and year over year over the last decade, we have facilitated and seen roughly 2,800 megawatts of wind every single year for 10 solid years. And so that translates into about 3 turbines stood up every single day. And that includes the pandemic. So wind is being built constantly in SPP on average for the last decade. But one thing about our queue is the solar number. So the solar has really been exploding in our queue, and the desire to build more solar. And so it's as of last year, it exceeded, and as you can see in the pie chart, it's exceeded the amount of wind that's in the queue. So solar really is our next frontier. There are some challenges with solar being built. I think we have roughly 3 gigawatts of solar that have signed GIAs, but we have not seen that being built. So we're still at roughly 250 megawatts of installed solar capacity, which is not a lot compared to our 32 gigawatts of wind that's installed in SPP's region. So we have a massive amount of wind, and we can talk about that later this morning. Battery and storage is another one that's pretty exciting. All of our battery numbers are lithium ion based. Every single one of them are very similar technology as what's in your phone. We are excited about it. I can say, and we're about to get into resource adequacy and those kind of topics in just a minute, but batteries are not a source of generation, right? It's a charge or a discharge, and so it's a time shifting aspect of generation. But why we're excited is because it allows for an operational flexibility that we don't really have today, other than gas. And so I think batteries really do help complement wind and solar in moving into the transition. So that first probably 4 or 5 gigawatts of batteries that get installed in SPP are going to be quite useful for the reliability of the overall grid and footprint.
Real quick, Casey,
Yes.
if I could ask, on this chart, what is the average age of a request that's pending?
We're in the middle of, I want to say around 3 years, but I'd have to get you that stat. We are in the middle of getting out of our backlog, and it is actually working. So we've tried, this is our 3rd GI reform in about 15 years, and this one is working. We're seeing great progress, and currently our projection is the end of next year, we will be out of our backlog, meaning that will be caught up with updated requests.
And then let me follow up, based on resource adequacy needs, are you prioritizing a certain generation type over another?
Not in the GIQ, because
Okay.
that's Q based,
Right.
but in terms of our accreditation aspect and where we're moving, and I have a slide later on, but just the summary of it is that we do prioritize based on if a load responsible entity in Kansas, for instance, has firm service and they intend on using one of these resources. In the accreditation perspective, there's additional value in the capacity that we grant based on them purchasing firm transmission through that function.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Casey, a couple of
Casey,
just a couple comments.
Pardon me, Casey Dwight Keene, if I could ask a question before we move on from this. Pardon my interruption, CJ, but I want to address this to Casey if I could.
Sure.
Yes. I'm going to be the contrarian here a little bit, because when I look at this current GIQ, Casey, it concerns me a little bit. It's virtually all renewables. So I'm concerned, and I would ask the question, as our grid operator, how could you assure reliability when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, given the nature of this totality of this queue being in renewables?
You're jumping to some of our later slides, but it's a great question. And there's a variety of efforts that we're putting forth. I know some of the questions that I guess you all are looking to answer, get answered. So we are working towards additional requirements in our accreditation process. And that includes a seasonal plan and reserve margin. We're looking towards additional requirements and generation attributes, which you're jumping to this. So one aspect is ramp. We need controllable, rampable resources to be able to bounce against when wind drops. That's wind today. It could be solar, it could be a net amount of wind and solar. To your point, there are days where the wind just doesn't blow across 14 states. We have extremely good wind. On average, I think our capacity factor is 39 to 40%. However, there are days where it's sub 1 gig. So if we have 32 gigawatts on the system, roughly 15,000 turbines, we've had days where the minimum wind has been lower than 1,000 megawatts. And so to your point, how do we incentivize and ensure reliability? And so we have a number of efforts there. We're establishing a winter PRM. We're recommending generation attributes as part of resource adequacy or long-term capacity planning, which includes energy adequacy as well as ramping adequacy. There is a notion of queue jumping, but that's not exactly, that's in its infancy, but that's more of a, hey, if this resource is a firm resource that's necessary for reliability, could we, work with FERC, work with our stakeholders, obviously, to be able to establish some rules to be able to ensure that we're building the right generation. I can say that one net effect to our recent planning reserve margin increase was we've had a number of announced retirements be retracted. And so yes, there is a notion that you increase PRM within a year, you can't build anything within a year. But what we did do from a reliability perspective is we modified and changed the game in terms of the trajectory that we're heading, and allowed for planned retirements to stay online for a period of time. We are in a massive transition period, and we probably will be for the next 15 years. And so to your point, this is something that CJ and I and really SPP as a whole are working very clear path to and multiple fronts, even on the market side, to ensure that we're building out the right generation. But it's a great observation because we can build everything that's in this queue with 100 gigs, and if you did the math, even in the accreditation perspective of wind and solar, we still have times where we might be in trouble, and so we really need to get a handle on that.
Thank you for that, Casey. If I could follow up very briefly, is there a relationship between the wind non-availability and either peak winter or summer load demands?
There is a relationship, but it's not as bad as you might think. I think roughly we're at 15% of our install capacity has firm accreditation, and what we have seen is during winter and summer peak loads, the wind is not at its regional minimum. So again, this is all statistics based. We're trying to introduce reliability considerations and additional sensitivities, larger data set and weather patterns to really have a better appreciation, understanding to answer that question. At least at this point in time, I don't believe we've over accredited the wind that we have today.
Thank you for that. One other question, and I'll move on. I'll let you move on. I think you just indicated that there is, because of some of these reliability concerns, I believe that's what you were alluding to, that there is some reconsideration being given to retirements. I think that's what you're saying. Are you talking about coal retirements? Is that what you're talking about?
Coal and gas, there's been a number of retirements that were planned. They actually went through our attachment AB, so that they were pretty far along in the process to retire. And when we increased the PRM, I think they changed their mind based on their integrated resource planning. This is not necessarily Kansas. This is across the region, and we have had some announcements get retracted. So much so that they said, "Well, we were going to retire in 2025. Now we're making it 2099." Basically, which just push it out beyond the 10-year horizon. And so we did move the needle there. Again, there has been a lot of consternation around the planning reserve margin increase. And SPP is not, we are fuel type agnostic. We're also economically driven as well. So we want to make sure that if resources want to retire, if load responsible entities want to retire these coal and gas resources, we want to be able to facilitate that. And so that's why we're really having as one of our corporate goals, get a handle on resource adequacy so that we're providing the right data and incentives and requirements for all load responsible entities to make a better plan for their resources.
Thank you, Casey, for your responses.
You're welcome.
Yeah, Casey, before we leave this slide, and Commissioner King, you went exactly, your questioning went exactly where one of my comments was going to go, is the reliability attributes, and SPP is working to define the attributes, because we don't decide what gets built. We need to work to give the stakeholders the information so they know what the needs are on the system, such that good, reliable generation gets built to those, let's call it specifications, right? And it's a very complex thing to come up with, but we're working very hard. So that was exactly where one comment was going. The second one was, even given current systems, so this is all future projections, we see today forecasted wind above our minimum load today with installed capacity of today. So this is all future and even more. I just want to make that comment that we actually see conditions where we forecast more wind than we have load under today's systems. The last comment I'll make is on wind and accreditation. And I'll push back on my colleague just a bit, that I don't think we over accredit wind, but in Winter Storm Elliott, wind was well above accreditation during that 4-day period, and it was also below accreditation during that same 4-day period. So that's where you'll hear me talk about we're still a little out of step. We're working hard. And when I say we, that's from the board to the RSC down through our working groups and committees. We're working very hard to close that gap, but minimum conditions is still a real challenge for us. And when resources, wind, not just wind, but others, are below accreditation, it does cause real challenges, and we'll show some of that.
Thank you, CJ.
Real quick before we move on, just for clarity, Casey, on the slide, there's a hybrid. Would you mind defining that? I assume that's storage and wind, or storage and solar. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Currently, we're in the middle of getting all of the granularity in all of the agreements and requests for that hybrid, but the number right now is solar plus batteries, but we actually have some interest in requests for kind of the trifecta of wind, solar, and batteries, as well as wind and batteries. But that number mostly represents the solar plus batteries. And that's more of an administrative aspect, so that generation, interconnection customers and developers don't have to submit multiple requests for a single site.
Thank you much. Appreciate it.
Okay. There is a GIQ dashboard on SPP's website that I'm not sure how many know about. It's fairly new. I think we published it last year, and it is up to date. Again, it refreshes a couple of times a week. If you go to spp.org and you go to the engineering drop down to generation interconnection, then it's one of the top links, GI dashboard. And I just wanted to show this again. It's already, I looked at it last night. This slide is already out of date. I think we're over 500 projects now, but it's roughly the same amount of gigawatts in the queue. But this gives you a dynamic view. You can go on the website and kind of see. But one thing just to note, just for this presentation, is it's all over the place. So we have generally solar, wind, storage. These facilities are kind of being peppered all over the region. One thing that you can kind of, I guess, intuitively look at the SPP region and look at where the load is, where Kansas City is, where Omaha is, Oklahoma City, Tulsa, these load centers. And then you look at the profile of wind and even solar. And generally speaking, all of those good profiles are on the west side of the footprint. So there's a heavy west to east prevailing flow on the transmission system. And so you would think that developers would want to site wind and solar kind of on the other side of the transmission, so that they sort of avoid additional multi-million dollars of upgrades necessary to be able to ensure that deliverability. But what we're seeing is it's kind of a combination. We are still seeing a large amount of developers building out on the west side of the system because I guess their profile, the way that they're looking at their business case and forecast, is such that they're still able to make a solid business case to build because it's such a good wind profile or it's such a good solar profile. But inevitably, we do see continual congestion and transmission deliverability on the system due to just the saturation of renewables that are on the west side of our footprint. And I might want to pause here for a second. There was a question that was given to us around lockstep for transmission planning. I didn't add a lot of slides on transmission planning, but we are moving towards additional, I would say, more accurate futures in our transmission plan. I do have a couple of slides on that, but that will help better unlock the really production cost reduction and overall benefits that these renewables provide. And we are working to have that a lot more in line or aligned than in years past. And in fact, I might be getting to that now. Something that we're doing in our futures, we try to, another follow-up question of these GI numbers is what amount will get built? And what we've seen is, especially since this last reform and increasing some of our financial securities and decision point mechanisms that we've added to the GI process, we've seen, I want to say, more serious customers as opposed to speculative or maybe not strong business cases where they would kind of use us. I would say years past, they would use us almost like consultants to see whether or not their business case is solid. Now we're seeing very serious customers and their projects are a little stronger. And so what that means is that ultimately those numbers, the likelihood of them being built is higher. And so we use that data and kind of over time build up a database to determine what is going to be built out of this queue. And we use that for a variety of reasons and ways in our business function. So one is this graph. It kind of shows you out of the queue. Again, we peak at 53 gigawatts. So this kind of shows you, this is just, it hadn't even been built yet, but it shows you the blue is executed GIAs, what already has GIAs, and it's really waiting up on the developer to work to integrate and interconnect. But then we also use a percentage based on historical GI builds to accurately predict what will actually be built. So this is kind of based on the commercial operations date that they've told us, and getting through the backlog, then we're going to see kind of an inrush over the next couple of years of additional installs based on what we've seen. Now, again, it's one of those things you.
This
Okay.
is Josh France with Curb. I'm sorry to interrupt, but and I'm sorry if you already defined this, but what is a GIA?
Oh, it's a generation interconnection agreement. And so once they
Gotcha.
have that, then they have everything they need to, at least from an RTO perspective, they have their costs to interconnect. They have the identified upgrades necessary to interconnect. We've already worked with the TOs on what is necessary and feasible to be able to interconnect to their system. We've even done affected system studies if it's on the seam with MISO or Associated Electric. So the GIA is kind of that definitive document to help them, secure, I guess, the remaining portions of the funds for whatever bank or whoever they're working on to get the project built.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
This is Leo, just to follow up on Josh's question. So how many that are actually in the GIA get built? Is it pretty much a guaranteed 100% get built out of once they got a GIA?
No, in fact, it's as you can see this curve on the bottom, we're doing a 40% of the queue. So out of that 90 plus gigawatts, we're projecting around 40% of that gets built. And that actually is. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, what I was saying was once that they have a GIA, do they get built?
The most of the time, I think it's over 90%. We have seen most of the time it's delays as opposed to it not getting built at all.
Given that fact, how far do the delays push it back? Typically,
it varies. I mean, we've seen that. I think there's a 3-year window that once they have the GIA, they have 3 years to get it built. And there are some other provisions that might extend that, but that's the hard rule, I guess, in the tariff. And we have seen that it's taken more than 3 years after they've gotten the GIA, such that they actually lose their GIA and they have to go back through the queue, because the theory from a tariff perspective in SPP process is that the system will have changed so much in that time frame that really the studies that we did to reliably interconnect are almost invalid at that point.
okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so retirements, and this is, we're kind of building up to the case of resource adequacy, but a lot of this stuff is how we best predict the future, right? And it's very difficult. We have a number of utilities. Everyone has, necessarily there could be state goals, there could be federal goals, there could be customer goals. I know that load responsible entities want more load, and some of the newer load are kind of requiring certain aspects of, let's say, green energy or renewable energy. And so SPP tries to not be a barrier to that. And we try to allow for our business processes to work seamlessly. And one of the challenges is trying to predict these things and get ahead of these things. Retirements is one that's very difficult because, and we try to understand where our members are coming from. The members don't necessarily they may be planning for a retirement 3 years out, but they don't necessarily want, for a variety of reasons, to tell the public that a particular power plant is about to retire. And it could be, HR reasons for the actual plant operators. It could be the rate base that, they don't necessarily want the state to know necessarily that they're planning on retiring until they're actually ready to make that decision. And so we've made some strides at SPP to better predict retirements. And one of those is to get notified a year in advance. So that is part of our attachment AB, and our rules is to get notified a year in advance. That's really not long enough for our prediction of reliability, and some of the conversation we had earlier around, do we have the right generation mix? You can't build things overnight. So a retirement notification a year from now is not necessarily the best for resource or energy adequacy. If CJ's organization is using a particular resource for reliability purposes, and then we're notified a year out, there's not a lot of elegant processes to be put in place to be able to keep that resource online. So this gives you the latest projections from our 2023 ITP. So our 2023 ITP was scoped about a year ago. Each ITP is an integrated transmission plan. So this is our long-term transmission plan. And what we try to do is it's an annual plan. It ends roughly every October. We come to the membership and the board of directors with a portfolio of recommended notice to construct transmission plans. Well, part of that is we look 2, 5, and 10 years out in the future, and these are the latest projections of retirement. And so we use age-based retirements based on fuel type, but we are also moving towards leveraging load responsible entities integrated resource plans. This is an area that we really need to get more data and better and more accurate, trusted data for retirement plans, because it does translate into whether or not we were replacing coal or gas with a series of wind, solar, and batteries. And if our forward studies are not accurate in this regard, then it's going to give us an inaccurate result for recommendation of policy. But as you can see, there is a number of projected retirements in our transmission plan. Coal, being 5 gigawatts in the year 10 for base reliability model. But if you look back, you look out, these acronyms are future 2, year 10 in our market economic model. That is, coal at 13 gigawatts, being retired. And so what we try to do is use those retirement projections to best predict where we need to build transmission. Again, I think from a positive perspective, we have improved this over the last probably 3 years, both retirements and generation additions in terms of accuracy.
Can I ask, Casey, are we using the same modeling that, for example, on these projected retirements that MISO is using, or you're getting better? Is it because you're getting better because you've improved your modeling, or are you, how did you do that? Is this a modeling? If you could explain.
I think, yeah, so we do comparisons with MISO. We're not exactly the same because they have their member stakeholder process and we have our stakeholder process. And so, MISO members might change the age base year to say, if it's over 63 years, then we're going to retire it, and ours might be over 56 years. And so it's heavily stakeholder driven. I can say, generally speaking, all of our transmission plans have better forecasts because we have more data. We have more data and we're providing that data. And I think membership also, there's more of an appetite to recognize what's going on. And I could say that that's probably a whole conversation. It's just recognize the change in fleet and fuel mix change, the recognize that we need more transmission. If 5-6 years ago, I think there was less of an appetite to build transmission. So there was a less of an appetite to put some of these assumptions in the long-term plan because they knew that it would translate into additional transmission. I think that the tone has changed because of what's going on in the industry.
Okay. All right. And so I do see this as like a transmission friendly appetite that we have, which ultimately will transfer to, I know that's kind of front and center now. So balancing those costs, and I'm sure we'll get into it, but I just wanted to know if we mirrored MISO on this or not, or used the same modeling capabilities so that, we're sharing information, but that's all right.
Yeah, we are. In fact, they were here the Wednesday and Thursday this week. MISO was, and we're definitely we talk. So,
thank you.
see. Okay, I'm going to try to speed it up just a little bit, but but this is the latest and greatest. I think the Kansas Commission gets to see this new information, and we just created these graphs and out of our ITP results. But what I like about it is it helps show the trends out of our market economic model. So it's actually an hourly model, 8760, 5 and 10 years from now. And you have your future one and future two, which they're kind of bookends of reasonability of where our membership feels like we're going. And so what's interesting is just the wind profiles, and kind of you look at the trends of coal going down, you look at gas, which is somewhat maintains, but you can see the uptick in the solar. Without diving into all the details, I think it's just a clear indication of just the overall fuel mix, and some of the challenges that CJ may be covering later this morning, and where we're heading.
And Casey, this is Andrew French. Just to make clear, I think it's indicated here since it says generation and you talked about hourly profiles. This is energy production, not installed accredited capacity, right?
Yes, correct. It's basically taking all of that information that's member vetted and running simulations, and this is the energy production.
This is the volume of electrons that are going to come from each source, or as projected. Right. Okay.
Right. That's why I like these graphs, because you can clearly see where the fuel mix change is happening.
This is Joshua Kerb again. I guess, and this goes back to your point earlier about batteries being storage. So with batteries as storage in a chart like this, I'm assuming like if you have solar generated and it's stored in a battery, that's attributed here to solar because you can't attribute to a battery, right?
Correct. It's a time shifting device, and in fact, due to round trip losses and heat, batteries are a load. They're effectively a load.
Interesting. Thanks.
Okay. This is, I think, our last slide on the futures and where we're heading with transmission. It takes a second to probably absorb and understand what we're showing. Everything to the left in the green and the blue are actual. So that's where kind of CJ lives in the operations world. So that's fact. This is what was in service and what was registered year over year. Moving up to this green, and then purple transition. Now, what we've done is tried to extrapolate out where our predictions are. As I mentioned, year over year, we've installed 2,800 megawatts, but we have seen kind of a slower amount of wind in the queue. It's still a lot in the queue. And so we're trying to better predict where that's heading. And as you can see, one thing to note is the 2023 ITP numbers that we just looked at, that's the purple. And so if you just kind of follow that line from the blue and green out, and either you trust future 2, which is the dark purple, or future 1, which is the light purple, it's still more than what we have today, either way. The 2024 ITP stretches that even further. And again, this is very member driven and survey based and vetted through our stakeholders. And there's an appetite to look at these numbers in a more aggressive way. Basically, they're looking at 2023 and they're saying it's not enough. We think that it's happening even faster and more. And so that's where this gold yellowish number comes from. And so this is the 2024 ITP, which again, that was recently approved in the January MOPSI. And it's the way you read that is the portfolio will be ready at the end of 2024.
Casey, maybe I can say this and make a comment, and you can tell me if it's right or not. When you say the membership has an appetite to look at those futures more aggressively and consider that some of those renewables may be coming online even faster, that's not necessarily an indication that that's what they want to occur. It's an indication that they think that may be what is going to occur. And so if we don't plan for that from a transmission standpoint, more aggressively, we're going to put ourselves in a worse position from both a reliability standpoint and an economic standpoint, that we're leaving something on the table and putting ourselves in a worse position if we don't plan a little more accurately and aggressively. Is that accurate to say
Yes.
that? Okay.
Yes, absolutely. There's a recognition that we're already somewhat behind. And again, I think we've gotten better, as you can see. It's starting to follow the actual trend we've seen. But you're correct. I think there's more of a recognition that we need to be a little higher in our number projections.
Hey, Casey, this is Justin Grady. Just quickly, so I'm trying to make sense of, I'm comparing this slide back to slide 6, and slide 6 for me was, I don't know, shocking is a little too strong of a word, but if I'm looking at this correctly, SPP's, prediction is for almost 40,000 megawatts of new generation to be online by 2025.
That is what's active study, but you have to look at the lower number. It's still a lot. You have to look at the whatever is that magenta, brown, I guess, color, which is like 18 gigawatts. It's still a lot in the next couple of years. And so, but that's the discounted view. The yellow is what's in study, but the brown is what we kind of discount of what would actually get built.
Okay, so that blue cumulative generation line, that is the cumulative generation line if everything that was in active study was built?
Correct.
Okay, yeah, that's a huge clarification. Thank you.
Yeah,
that makes more sense.
Appreciate the question.
Because I'm looking at slide 9 and I'm going, what, if we're going to have almost 40,000 megawatts of new generation online by 2025, then slide 9 is really, really off, right? So,
right.
Thanks, sir. Appreciate the clarification.
You're welcome. All right, change topics just a little bit. Get right into resource adequacy. So. At a high level, and I really like this analogy staff put together, but resource adequacy is really like building a bench. And you can kind of take this analogy pretty far in a sports analogy, but you kind of pretend like as a region, we are the coach or we're a recruiter, and our job is to build the overall team. And so you have a certain amount of, every Major League Baseball team has a certain budget, right? And you can't put all of your eggs in a particular star player. You also can't double your star players on the bench. And so it really comes down to, and recognize that you have to have a bench. And so resource adequacy is the same way. We have to make sure that we have a buffer for the inevitable. In fact, I think CJ and the operations folks deal with roughly 2 generator trips a day. So when we talk about performance or we talk about winter scenarios, it's a daily occurrence that we lose generation. And it's kind of recognizing the fact that we have all our parts of 14 states. There's over 800 power plants in our market registration. And so just by sheer volume and risk and probability, machines just break. And so what we have to do is recognize and build for that. And so the resource adequacy is trying to optimize what that bench strength looks like. And we could ratchet up the planning reserve margin, our bench strength to 30% or 50%, but someone has to pay for these things. And it's extremely expensive to build capacity. And so there is this real balance of economics and reliability, and making sure that we're setting these requirements such that the members of Kansas State, the load responsible entities, can come to the commission with a reasonable and sound resource plan that is commensurate or recognizing the planning reserve margin and bench strength that we've kind of established as a region. So in a nutshell, that's what it is. We're trying to establish these the optimized bench strength. So how we do that, we run a loss of load expectation study Currently, we do it every other year. We're actually in the middle of finalizing our scope and doing some data gathering on the 2023 loss of load expectation. And what it tries to do is run a series of statistics through a Monte Carlo simulation. And mathematically, what you're trying to do is go through various load profiles and additional weather patterns and resource mix, and try to assume what amount of loss of load would actually occur based on a statistical analysis. And it's hundreds of simulations. This is a pretty good graph in the bottom right to kind of show you, and I wish there was like maybe a dynamic way of just, sliding those over, because you can kind of move the demand and supply, and you can change your LOLE. And as you get further along and you have your loss of load expectation lowered, which means the appetite of risk is low. You don't want any loss of load at all. Well, then what that does is that makes the margin higher. So as you separate out the demand profiles and the supply profiles, you're ratcheting up the reserve margin. Conversely, if you squeeze them together, and this is where CJ gets nervous, is we have a really high appetite for loss of load. We're fine with losing load 2 or 3 times a year. Then you're kind of simulating the overlap of demand and supply such that you're okay with losing load. This is something that EPRI and the industry has kind of done some deeper dives. What's interesting is there's this notion of 1 day in 10, and that is what we use from a criteria. I say notion because no one really knows where that came from. Even in the 60s, it was used in planning resources. It's just to me, it's a defined criteria to say, this is what the appetite for loss of load. But it's being questioned across the industry because there's a number of questions here. One is it enough? Does it actually incentivize the right capacity to be built? And from SPP staff perspective, it's not enough. It's an indicator of risk, and it's something that we should continue. But there's a number of activities that we need to do in parallel, especially given the nature of wind and the nature of solar, and ensuring that we're reliable.
Casey, could I just add one thing? I think you're actually going to get into this with the idea of unserved energy, but one of your other criticisms of loss of load, it tells you how many, 1 day in 10, so the number of events where you might have an outage, but it doesn't tell you anything about the magnitude of an event of, how many hours did load not get served. And so that is one thing you all are doing work to try to get better metrics around is quantifying the magnitude of events, correct?
Yes. Yeah. So instead of just looking at the account of, to your point, the number of events, and then having that as your threshold that establishes the reserve or your bench, it's when that happens, do you lose 1,000 megawatts of load? Do you lose 50 megawatts of load? That's an aspect that we're working on, and we'd like to be able to establish what that criteria is for the region sometime in 2023. So we have stood up the resource. I think Kim mentioned that, and you were a big proponent of that, and to kind of get that started. It's a resource.
Yes, I put some extra
energy
work on your table.
Yeah, you did. Yeah. But it's a good thing. So just so the commission knows, we started a resource and energy adequacy leadership team that reports to the regional state committee. It's comprised of some board members, some state commissioners, but also some stakeholders as well. And that's one of the primary goals, is to establish that expected unserved energy. And so it's establishing some kind of a megawatt value as a secondary criteria for enforcement. And effectively, this might cost members money. I mean, if we're ultimately talking, at the end of the day, it's changing the trajectory of the capacity and generation that gets built. But the good thing about the EUE is the reliability component as well as the economic component, because if we don't add that expected unserved energy as a secondary criteria, the only tool we have right now is PRM. and that's the bench strength number. And without any other secondary criteria, we will just continue to ratchet up the PRM. So you kind of have to look at almost a matrix of what we're trying to do to be able to best optimize the generation mix. And ultimately, it should save ratepayers money.
So Casey, just to follow on to that, I mean, if we have that in combination with PRM, do you think the expected unserved energy piece, which gets you a little more granular detail, I mean, is that one of the tools that we will be able to leverage to try to drive more toward getting the full generation mix that has the attributes that we need for reliability?
Yes, I do. Yeah. What we've seen is, especially solar, the more solar we add to our LOLE study, the higher that expected unserved energy goes. And it's kind of to the earlier comment that sometimes the sun doesn't shine, even if it's during the day hours. In a modeling perspective, solar's not that great during the winter, and even during the summer seasons, you're not always getting the full capacity. So we've seen that expected unserved energy ratchet up. And again, it all comes down to the appetite for risk, the appetite for the state commissions and the load responsibilities, and SPP as a balancing authority. What risk are we willing to take? So I don't know how much we want to spend on this one. I did include it just in terms of the reasons for the PRM and what it incentivized. We were at 12%. And we raised it to 15%, and that is effective for this upcoming summer. And as I mentioned, one of the primary net reliability benefits was kind of delays in retirements. But we are, seeing some additional adjustments in resource plans and so forth. But again, that's not the end answer. That's certainly not what I think SPP staff wants to see, is just us continually ratcheting up that particular number. We really need to work on these other things.
Can I ask real quick, if Storm Uri had not happened, would SPP have increased their resource adequacy? That's one. Secondly, has MISO increased their resource adequacy as well?
So I'm not sure about the second question in terms of their increase. I know that MISO did recently go to a 4-season PRM, and which is very interesting. Instead of just a summer enforcement and summer peaking, they're actually doing a planning reserve margin per season.
And isn't that due to the fact that that's when generally maintenance occurs on a lot of load, and so that needs to be balanced as well?
Yes, that's one of the primary drivers. And what we're doing, working with our supply adequacy working group, is establishing a second PRM. Right now we have a planning reserve margin for both summer and winter, but it's the same number. So it's 15% for both summer and winter. We actually don't target individualized winter season PRM. Based on Uri, Elliott, really even just non-extreme event winters, we are starting to see risk go up in the winter season. And we suspect that particular PRM will be in the 20%, 22% times. Don't quote me on the exact number. It's got to be studied, but it's going to be higher than 15%. And so that is in recognition to some of the concerns that we've seen and data that we've seen that drives these models. To your point about the shoulder seasons, we have had a phenomenon that's quite interesting in operations the last maybe 2 years, where typically we do whatever we can to allow a generator to take maintenance, because if you don't, it's almost like oil changing your car. I mean, you can prolong it, but you're just making things worse. So we have to be able to allow these generators, if they want to take an outage for maintenance, we need to figure out how to best to do that. We typically only deny outages, and this is years ago, for transmission considerations where you have maybe one generator's taking an outage and we're trying to coordinate. That's, outage coordination, trying to make sure that they're not taking it at the same time. What we've seen recently and this is due to some of the actual retirements that we've had with gas and coal coming offline, is that we have to deny outages because of wind, because these shoulder months are low load periods. We have high wind, and we need a certain amount of rampable capacity, controllable capacity online. And so we've had to actually coordinate outages, maintenance outages around wind and net load profiles, which is quite interesting. So it's getting to your point around, if we establish a winter PRM and we establish a summer PRM, do we have enough, I would say, conventional resources or rampable capacity to be able to manage the maintenance on the other conventional resources during those shoulder months? At this point in time, SPP is not intending to pursue a shoulder season PRM. We're looking at the stats, and we're looking at how can we approach it from just doing winter and summer and doing these other activities, as Commissioner French mentioned, or the EUE criteria. And if we can do these things and design them properly, then we cover the shoulder months. But that is something that we're keeping an eye on.
Okay, so also with our PRM, we're also allowing greater, and I keep referring to MISO because I know we need to have that strong relationship and that symbiotic relationship. Isn't that also part of the rationale, is it improves our symbiotic relationship with them, and that then we can transfer back and forth?
Yes, that's correct.
All right.
Yeah, and Casey,
Okay,
just
given
a quick comment. Quick comment.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Casey, the chair question. I honestly don't think we would be talking about this if it wasn't for Uri. Staff came to the working groups back in 2018 and sort of sounded the alarm, right? We knew we were getting tighter, we were getting more alerts. It was received pretty lukewarm. Now, we didn't predict Uri, but please don't make comments that way. Like, we saw that. We did not think we were that tight. And then I think you have to look at the raising of the PRM and the resistance that we met even after Uri. And it gives me a minute or second to greatly thank the RSC and Commissioner French for supporting what staff was recommending. We had a huge challenge getting that across the line, and that was even after Uri. So you asked that question, a really good question, and my personal opinion is no, we would not be talking about this.
Okay. Thank you for the questions. This is great. Definitely the information we wanted to convey. So I'm going to probably speed up. Yeah, go ahead.
I ask a question. I'm sorry, just to follow up a minute on something you said to Chair Duffy. You said that sometimes you'll deny outages because there's too much wind during the shoulder months. Does it work the reverse also, where you would actually curtail wind because you don't have enough rampable capacity?
Yes, that's correct. And in fact, that is something that's been discussed for a number of years now, is the notion of I guess you would curtail wind to not allow it to get up to a spot where you can't replace it. Now, we've done that in individual perspective, more from a transmission congestion. CJ, you may be able to answer from a regional perspective. I don't believe that we've actually executed it pro rata across all wind yet. But it's definitely something that we're trying to establish from a process perspective.
Yeah, the more common example that we get into that Casey was alluding to is that, and I have a slide on our generation assessment process, a gap. We love our acronyms. We're going to try our best to define those as we go. But really, it's getting harder and harder to look out in the future and determine how much load, I like to think of it as load following capability you're going to have in order to allow these outages to occur from a capacity perspective is getting really challenging. And ultimately, and we'll talk more about it, but ultimately what that drives is more forced outages, which is not a good thing as we're pushing things down the road.
I'm just going to touch on, and thanks CJ. So I want to make sure that I'm saving some time for you. I'm going to touch on the ELCC though, just for a minute, and it is important. We are moving towards an industry recognized standard for effective load carrying capability. So it kind of goes back to the earlier conversation that wind does have accredited value, but it's complicated. And I think that's intuitive because we can't control the wind, and the likelihood you're kind of taking the risk on the likelihood of wind blowing during peak times or even near peak times, like the top 3% of hours for the year, for instance. And so what we've done is established this criteria, and this kind of gives an indication, this slide, on what percentage of installed capacity for load responsible entities would receive in accredited value per season. So solar, I think, is more intuitive, at least for me, because you can kind of see almost like a sine wave. Sometimes we have double hump days in terms of load, but if you just think of SPP's load profile throughout the day and then at night as a sine wave, and you just chop the hours where it's sunny, then there's no more accredited value beyond that hump in the overall days. And this is kind of illustrative of that it starts to tank at some point based on, let's say, summer days where we can't accredit any more solar because there's just not enough load that exceeds beyond what is maximum load at night or even dusk hours. And so that at least is a little bit more intuitive to think about for than wind, because wind kind of is all over the place. But at a high level, that's what we do, is we attempt to do that. We have tiered approaches based on firm transmission and the intent of the load responsible entities as well. So there's a lot more to this than just this graph, but it kind of gives you an indication that we are heading in a world where we are accrediting wind and solar, and we just need to be very careful about how much we do at the LRE level as well as how much we do at the regional level. Okay, performance-based. So changing resource fuel types to more conventionals. And this is somewhat Winter Storm Uri and maybe even Elliott, but we've been talking about this for a number of years. Traditionally, we have accredited, let's say, coal or gas based on testing criteria. And that's worked for quite some time, but primarily because we really had a lot of capacity at SPP. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we had a lot of installed capacity. Since that's getting tighter and tighter, we recognize that we need to move towards more of a performance-based accreditation. And so this comes down to a calculated method for what we call equivalent forced outage rates. And so it's trying to figure out almost a in management control type of scenario, to where we're trying to statistically calculate the performance of these individual resources and give accreditation based on those performance. So if it's a resource that performs, if CJ's organization, if operations calls upon a gas turbine, a combined cycle plant or a combustion turbine to start based on their market offered parameters, and it starts every single time, then the performance accreditation is going to be extremely high. In fact, there's different ways to kind of remove force majeure or other aspects that somewhat, from a reliability perspective, kind of increases the reliability risk a bit. But what membership really wanted to do is isolate that. Is it something that they could actually control? And that's what we need to be measured against, so that it incentivizes performance. And I do believe what we ended up with does incentivize performance. It should incent resource planners and load responsible entities to be able to, generator owners to be able to calculate and best understand what investment they need to make to be able to better increase their performance, which hopefully increases and augments some of the recommendations we've had out of the outcomes of the past two winter storms. As you can see, the membership did agree to phase this in. This was primarily, they didn't want a shock to performance-based accreditation and get hit with a number of deficiency payments, because maybe they were somewhat reliant on each other as a region, which is part of the benefit of the RTO. But they didn't want to get hit with payments that maybe they weren't prepared for if their particular fleet wasn't performing as well as it should. And so that was part of the reasoning for phasing it in, such that they agreed with the notion to do it, but they wanted some time to kind of make some adjustments in their capacity and fleet management. Okay. I think I've covered the resource adequacy requirement, why we went to 15% in the winter season obligation. We are looking to move to an individualized winter PRM. So going to the Winter Storm Uri, as I mentioned, the winter storm resource adequacy, the performance-based accreditation, both in winter and summer, those are outcomes of Uri as well, and to try to better enhance the capabilities. The last one I did want to spend a second on. We have built a database of 40 years of weather actuals and are starting to build, we're in the middle of this for our 2023 LOLE study, to have more enhanced accuracy in extreme conditions for generator outages. So effectively be able to use these weather profiles and then use a combination of actual data that we've had in the marketplace, and then extract that over time for the targeted years that we have for our resource loss of load expectation study, and then apply extreme conditions, reasonable extreme weather conditions that would ultimately take the resource out in our models. And then that will translate into a more accurate PRM, which in effect does better prepare us for extreme conditions. And that's both in cold and hot temperatures. So another thing that we've done as the Improved Resource Adequacy Task Force that was stood up after Winter Storm Uri, and it's still, I guess, being discussed, is firm fuel requirement. So there, staff has brought a proposal to that task force. Right now, nothing's been approved. It's still being discussed and modified. But the question is, should we require firm fuel for some portion of a particular LRE's fleet to be more reliable? And CJ may get into this, but there was a lot of conversation and concern based on firm fuel pipeline incentivizing the pipeline structure to be better built out and prepared for, because a number of our resources just don't purchase firm fuel. Tracking behind the meter resources, there's a number of resources that we have that are behind the meter. There's also demand response, electrification, EV. There's a number of things that are actually happening on the grid and impactful to the grid. And that's part of trying to understand and better appreciate the magnitude of controllability on the load side for accreditation. And then, as Commissioner French mentioned, the EUE. So this is something that we're really, I guess I would say, excited about to be able to best optimize economics and reliability as a secondary criteria here. So we're exploring that. That is a 2023 goal, is to help establish what that criteria is. Okay, let's see. I wanted to, and CJ, please chime in on here. I wanted to bring up a couple. I didn't have slides. Hopefully, can you guys see that? Am I sharing just my screen, or?
Yeah, we're seeing the market considerations. Yeah, Casey, if we're going to go over questions, but given time, we may just save it to the end and see what we didn't answer, I think is my recommendation.
That sounds good. That sounds good, CJ. Okay, so these will go by fast, but we can share these slides so you can kind of, take a better appreciation. But there were some questions around where Kansas sits. And so this is a fuel mix by state. Again, it's very colorful, so I'll try to just guide you through a few things. But green is wind, blue is coal, and you can kind of see where Kansas sits. Now, this is just a percentage of yearly generation energy. So you can see, as Kansas as a state, there's a large part of wind in Kansas, obviously. But comparing to the remaining states, I mean, Oklahoma is, I guess, comparable, but they have more gas, and that's percentage by state. Kansas is the green on the left, and this is all generation in 2021 by state. So 21%, I guess, in the SPP region. So it has to be noted that, we include Texas, but that's only the Texas portion that's in SPP. It's not ERCOT, for instance. But as a region, as a balancing authority, Kansas provided 21% roughly. Their demand was 16.5. So you can kind of intuitively see Kansas as a net exporter to the rest of the market. And then this kind of gives you an overall profile. Again, I'll share this so you can kind of see where it's at. But Kansas is the kind of the blue in the bottom, and you can kind of see the percentage of gigawatt hours that were in demand compared to the SPP footprint and where the overall monthly demand comes from.
And Casey, just for clarity on that last slide, when you say Kansas is a net exporter, you're not saying one of our load serving entities is necessarily exporting. You're saying, all generation coming out of Kansas, including like merchant wind plants, is included in that. So just all generation within the state is a net export, not necessarily that our load serving entities are exporting, correct?
That's great clarification. It's purely market based and balancing authority based. So it does include all generation that resides within Kansas, including merchant generation. And it's overall, the notion is that the generation profile exceeds the demand profile for the state. So for whatever reason, likely economics associated with the overall mix versus the mix of the remaining states in the region, Kansas was pushing.
Yeah, I just wanted to make that clarification. Sometimes we get questions or comments about, are our retail customers, paying to push power to other places, and that's not necessarily what's occurring in a market-based dispatch of all generation in the state. So that was the clarification I wanted to make.
Yeah, Casey. So that's really unfair because that was going to be my question. So thanks, Commissioner French. But what I was wondering about is if, and I'm sure you guys have the data somewhere, but do you have a sense of that? The relative proportion of our generation of 20.9%. Do you have a sense of how much of that is merchant? Just purely wind that's not paid for by any retail ratepayer in Kansas, but it's oriented towards a Google farm or Amazon or something like that.
Yeah, I do not offhand, not at the state level, but we do have that data. So we could certainly provide that. I can work with Ben and we can provide that for you all.
Yeah, that would be really
helpful. A problem.
That would be really helpful, mainly to provide some clarification and color around, exactly what Commissioner French was talking about, right? It frequently in the conversation recently in Kansas, it's Kansas is exporting power to the rest of the region, and our retail customers of investor-owned utilities are not getting compensated for that, and there's an assertion that there's an inequity occurring, and I don't, I'm not coming down on one side or the other of that debate, but the information that you're going to follow up with will really help just to clarify that, right? So thank you.
So real quick, I believe that Justin is hit upon a real sore point with a lot of legislative members, and to have that data and build it into our slide deck and our explanation will be extremely helpful, because that's the explanation where people, I've just heard it said, we're giving it all away. They're building all this stuff so somebody else can have it. And I do believe we need to peel back the layers of the onion on that. And this data would be extremely beneficial.
Okay. Yeah, there's some additional questions we'll need to ask, but we can work with you, Justin, or just in terms of purchase power agreements. Let's say Evergy has a purchase power agreement with a wind farm that's in Nebraska. I mean, there's some things that it's a lot more complicated than just circling the GPS, locations of the and then pulling out the merchant. So we'll have to figure out how best to do that. But we could certainly provide the commission
Yeah,
that type
Casey,
of data.
this goes back to the concern. I mean, the question that was raised is why are we belonging here to the SPP if they're just using us and using our fuel? Why is it beneficial to belong? And I do think we need to continue to educate and share information.
Casey, one other comment, and that will be of interest. And there are times, even though the average will show, what it shows here is an exporter, there will be times that a lot of entities and states will be importers throughout the event. So I think you have to be a little careful too, that when you look at an overall average, we've seen that through different events, right? Where you have low water events, we push more power up north. When we have colder weather down in the south, we clearly push power south. I was just going to make that comment that there is a lot of layers, but I totally get the question. Casey, we can definitely get y'all some information to help. It's just it gets pretty complex as you start unlayering.
Yep. And
It's
to
always-
that point, CJ,
It's always more complicated than it seems. So no, that's one thing that after the number of years I've spent in this business, I understand. I appreciate you guys being willing to work with us to get some clarity around that. So thanks a lot.
This is Josh with Curb. You mind if I ask a question? So, with the queue, with the interconnection queue, I mean, do you do any projections going forward for those ratios of generation to demand, and what that might look like as far as whether we might stay an exporter or how that would look?
we could extract that from the data that we use in the ITP. We do provide that market economic model to members. And so that's generally public to our stakeholders. And so if we extracted that value, basically we could do some of that, but we don't have it readily available at the state granularity.
No, that's fine. I appreciate that. Thanks.
And I did want to, I guess, tack on to CJ's comment. I think that was a great comment. And even on the exporting side, being a part of the RTO and Kansas in particular, which is quite interesting, there's been times where we have seen more wind generation within Kansas than the overall load profile of Kansas. So from a overall, I guess, 100% renewable and how you would slice the data, that would not happen if Kansas was not part of an RTO. So you kind of have to look at it from a variety of angles, that even at times of exporting through a pre-market or bilateral market, there would not have been a way for Kansas as a state to do what they're able to do. It's kind of an enablement factor of our overall region and economies of scale. So I think I'm going to skip right to CJ. And as CJ mentioned, we do have some market questions, or we had some market questions. If we have some time, we can answer some of those as well. CJ, you want me to just go ahead and just keep going? Okay.
Yeah, just keep control that way. I don't have to mess it up and waste everybody's time as I try to transfer. So greatly appreciate the time. And again, just a comment, greatly appreciate the support working with, Commissioner French and others as we work through some really difficult decisions and situations. So it's been really good, the partnership we have with our stakeholders, and just from my seat, from the operations more in the trenches, just greatly appreciate that. This is really important to show just the progression of system alerting. I commented earlier to Chair Duffy about my comments about Uri and what it's driven. I believe in life, think there's positive and negatives with everything. And a positive out of Uri is it probably accelerated everybody's willingness to have some of these discussions, because they are very difficult and they are very expensive propositions that we're looking into. But you can see just the progression of alerts. And we had to update the 2022, as you all will remember. We were supposed to have this meeting right before Christmas, and we had the nice Christmas gift of Elliott that we all got to live through and work through. And we spent a bunch of time in the control room around the Christmas holidays, and our alerting really went up as part of that, where we did have our first EEAs, and the EEAs, the Emergency Energy Alert of the years. We had 2 EEA ones during Elliott, and quite a bit of alerting, whether it be conservative operations or resource alerts. And the point here is alerts give you an indication that we're tightening. We're concerned. Operations is, we have system conditions that are driving us to a point where we're uncomfortable with standard normal operations. So that's why it's meaningful to look at these trends. I like that, closer to the ditches. We're getting close enough to the ditches that we really feel like we need to heighten our alerts. And given our reserve margins and we have slides coming up to show that, keep going down and getting closer and tighter to our load, that we're seeing more and more. This is, given what Casey's already presented, I'm sure in your mind you're thinking, well, CJ, is this going to get any better? No, it's not. It's not going to get any better. We're going to see more alerts. We're going to see more tight conditions. That's why it is so critical that we're doing this great work around the IRATF and the real group, which I'm going to help participate in. So, I know Commissioner French said he gave us work, but I mean, this is the work to keep on giving us. I mean, this is the work that is truly valuable to the stakeholders, because, not to get on a soapbox, I have to be careful because I will. I mean, Uri showed us the importance of electricity. It really did. I mean, the state of Texas, I know it didn't hit our footprint quite as bad. We certainly had to turn the lights off, which was gut-wrenching and terrible. But look at the state of Texas and the life loss, and it was just awful. So I know we all want to do better, and we all want to do good work. So definitely looking forward to those efforts. Next slide, Casey. This is really showing, and I'm going to spend just a minute on this, because it's really important to understand kind of what you're looking at. The blue line that starts on 2018 and 2019 is what we calculate to be the actual reserve margin. We're going to call that an operating capacity margin in real time. Okay, so that's really what we had left. This is not Casey's world. So Casey's world is the purple line. We actually calculate on our long-term planning what we can anticipate to be our true reserve margin. The one thing that has surprised some folks is that we've had in our history well in excess of our actual reserve margin of 13%. We've held as high as 30+% in recent years. And that's why the things we're seeing today, in my opinion, the words I would use were hidden. They were hidden from us operationally. We had a lot of flexibility. There was a lot of excess. All that excess was conventional in nature. So again, we're fuel agnostic, not trying to pick on renewables. You can't just start a renewable. You have to have a fuel to start. So all of that has changed. And what we've seen is that number is decreasing, and the gap between those two lines is becoming more and more great. We're meaning that we're seeing less actual reserve margin. So the reason I like this slide, what we did is, starting in 2022, we took the very best we've been. So that's the top green line that flows. This is the rate graph. If you know anything about me, I like my analogies and I like to make things simple because that's how I learn. So this looks like a rake to me. So we call this the rate graph. The top line of the rake extending out after 2022 is if we experience the very best year. Okay, so that would mean that in real time we had the most operating capacity margin we've seen. Right, it was the closest to the PRM. That's what the expectation would be. So that's the very best scenario. Is we're going to see an increase in our conservative operations, and in the years pushing out to 2027, you can see what that would look like. So then the blue line, the baby blue color, is the average. Okay, so we just averaged. We averaged all of the prior years and said, that's probably a good estimation. So for me, I think the blue line is what I would consider to be a pretty solid planning type approach. And you can see, giving that, if we just consider the average, we're going to anticipate EEA 3s, which means we're utilizing our operating reserves. That's a deficient balancing authority. That's not a good place to be. We can see that as early as 2 years from now. And then you go to the bottom line. So the bottom line would be what most would consider the worst case. So that's the red line extended out of 2022. That would be the lowest we've seen. And obviously that's not a good picture. Okay, so when you drop below the load shed estimation line, that means we would anticipate maybe having to turn the lights off. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to, right? That's not what we're trying to show here. It's just trying to show that we're really working hard to make sure that we're closing that gap and making sure we have enough stuff on the bench. I think Casey's analogy was great. We need to make sure we have enough resources on the bench to cover us. At 15% PRM, okay, so that's what we move the number to. You see the red line, and that's where it crosses, is if we got down to truly having only 15%, that's what it would look like. And you can see, on average, we're still going to have an EEA 3 a year. That's not great, but it is better than if you kept it at 13%, which is actually off the chart, right? We can't even show 13% because it would be too far to the right. So I thought this was really a really good slide we developed. I have one more, but I'm going to pause right there because I want to make sure you guys, appreciate, because the question about why did we raise the PRM? Why did that matter? Why was it so important to staff? This is why it was so important. All right, so no questions. We'll move to the next slide, which really gets into the expected unreserved energy concept. And I really like this one that was developed as part of the PRM work. And I'll explain it pretty quickly, just a high level here. So we'll start on the left side of this graph. That is the prior LOLE studies, where you can see that we were well below, we call it the zone of no entry. That's that pinkish area where we're anticipating load shed more than 1 day in 10 years, or from the expected unreserved energy use, we're not seeing any of that. So that's the prior year's PRM studies, the loss of load expectation studies. You can see that we were well below. The risk factors were low, well low. We didn't talk about it. I mean, it was so low, it was really not a meaningful conversation to bring up. So now you come to the slides to the right. So that's the 3, the 13, the 14, and the 15. And we looked at those from 2 cases, one being a very best case, so that's S1. The other S2 would be a more aggressive case. I'm probably going to tell you that I like preparing for S2. Our stakeholders and Casey might say, yeah, but we probably want to prepare somewhere in the middle. My pushback on that is if ever I can figure out how to serve average load and keep the lights on, I'll be willing to do that. But unfortunately, we have to serve all the load all the time. So if you look at that, you can see the dramatic increase in the risk. So at 13% PRM, we had 504 megawatts of expected unserved energy, which is 30 times higher than 2017. I mean, it's an order of magnitude worse than we had been projecting. And that's what we were trying to convey from staff's concern, and that this was a really big deal. That Casey said it, and I definitely want to reiterate. We understand you can't build generation overnight. We get it, and we did not like having to do this to the stakeholders and make them feel like we were rushing it and didn't give them enough time. That's not ideal. But at the end of the day, we have a responsibility, and that responsibility was to do our very best to keep the lights on. And Casey's already mentioned it, but we've seen a lot of activity from cancel retirements to generation staying within the footprint that we were really driving towards. So I think we're much better prepared for it, and I think we've seen the benefits. So just quickly, progressing to 14 and 15, you can see that the only PRM that keeps us relatively close to years past was the 15% that we landed on. So I think this graph does a fantastic job of showing why 15% was a good number. Now, at the end of the day, knowing what I know, 15% is not this number that makes me not worry about anything going forward. We're still going to be tight, as the prior graph shows, where you're still looking at EEA3 possibilities, and those are not ideal operating conditions. But I do appreciate and agree it's always a balance, right? We can't copper plate the system. Electricity can't get so high that nobody can afford it. We do have a due diligence to do to balance reliability and economics. And that's why I definitely believe 15% is an absolute step in the right direction. I think this graph shows it in a good way. So I'm going to pause there again just to make sure there's no questions.
Question for me, the expected unserved energy metric, is that occurring, several times throughout the year in these models because of transmission overloads and congestion, or is that occurring in one big Winter Storm Uri-like or peak summer type scenario?
Yeah, Casey can jump in here. It's an aggregate, I believe, of the scenario, but Casey can jump in.
Yeah, it's not a transmission based. I mean, we do have deliverability zones and plan and reserve margin zones, but it's a pipe and bubble type of approach, so it doesn't actually model the overall transmission. So it's more the latter. It's a collection of when we actually see the loss of load period, which could be during the summer. It actually could be during a winter, but not necessarily during winter peak. Again, it's a statistical model, so it kind of looks at a variety of different load profiles and different generation profiles in the overall mix. But when we actually see that where the load is higher than the supply, then what we're seeing with the expected unserved energy is that value actually increasing in those particular events.
So these are load shed events that would affect the entire footprint.
Correct.
Yes.
And this is getting back to. Oh, sorry, CD.
No. Go ahead, Casey.
Well, I was just going to say this is getting back to the earlier conversation that Commissioner French mentioned on the EUE and establishing that criteria. It really dovetails into what CJ is mentioning. Are we okay? It's an appetite for that loss of load. What was interesting is when we changed the PRM back in 2015, there was not an appetite for 12 megawatt hours. It's not really shown on the graph on the left, but we had a sensitivity back in this 2015, 2017 timeframe. And at that time, there was no appetite for 12 megawatt hours. Now we're seeing orders of magnitude higher. And so we're still trying to figure out what that balance is. And so that's a big part of this year's effort, is trying to figure out where that threshold as a region we're comfortable with.
Is it because the correlation back in 2017 and at 12% now, is the correlation because the generation type has altered versus true load growth or intensity of weather events, predictability of weather events?
It is. I do want to recognize and not necessarily pick on solar and wind. There is a correlation to extreme events and the weather data set that we're giving the models, as well as load growth. But the magnitude of increase that we're seeing is largely attributed to the generation mix change.
Right. So the generation mix change was so phenomenal during that time frame and leading up to it that basically it's forced us into this position, correct?
Correct.
And Casey, when you say generation mix change, I guess I look at that two ways. I look at that as adding intermittent energy or resources that are difficult to forecast, but also the component of at the same time, you are subtracting or retiring dispatchable traditional resources. Can you speak to which one of those is more concerning? I mean, my take was that adding intermittent resources wasn't so much of a problem until you started subtracting your dispatchable resources. Is that kind of how you all looked at it? Is that
Yes.
sort of the order of magnitude?
Yeah, I believe we've retired upwards of 8 gigawatts of conventionals in this same time frame. It's fortunately slowed down a bit based on the projections we saw a few years ago. However, it's exactly what you just said. It's the change in fuel mix. So you couple the rampable capacity and dispatchable conventionals that operations has at their disposal, at the same time replacing that with solar and wind, and our models are basically saying yes, we can adhere to a single event 1 day in 10 years, which is 0.1 day in 1 year model, so 2.4 hours, and when that actually happens, the magnitude of load loss is higher because of the combination of change.
Thanks.
Yep, thanks, Casey, and great questions. Thanks, and please keep asking those. I mean, I know Casey and I've talked about this. We want to make sure we're hitting the points that you guys are concerned with. So do appreciate the interaction. Next slide, Casey. Wanted to show here, this is the past summer, which drove a lot of the conservative operations, because a lot of times because of Elliott and Uri, we spend a whole bunch of time talking about the winter, and I get it. It is a definite period of concern for us, but we're getting really tight in our summer conditions too. I think most believe that, because of, we don't have natural gas issues in the summer like we do in the winter, that everything's, just perfect in the summer, and we are getting very tight on what I will consider probably our more traditional period. And we're showing that, as you can see, the accredited capacity remaining is that middle-ish dip there to 395. That's all of the accredited capacity we had left on that day. And so you're talking about 50,000 megawatts, and we have 395 left. That is incredibly tight. When, as a system operator, you are on the edge of your seat for your 12-hour shift, I promise you. There's no room for error. That's the other thing that I'll mention that's really important for us to consider, is that when you leave less and less room for insurance, contingencies, constraints, all those words we would use to describe, it is so easy to step over the line from just one bad decision, quote unquote, that the system operators have to make decisions in seconds and minutes. They don't have the luxury of days and weeks to figure it out. And when you put them really close to those areas of concern, it doesn't take a whole lot for one bad decision to push into the EEAs or those type of things. So that's why I'm so adamant about, giving the very best system and forward studies we can for the system operators, because at the end of the day, it is so dynamic and complex in what we deal with. We don't have time today, but it would likely be interesting for you guys to hear all the work we're doing in uncertainty response. So we have a full team with a meteorologist on staff now that is doing tremendous work in predicting the unpredictability. And I know that sounds really weird, but it's really trying to predict those times and days where we need to be a little extra conservative, make a little more decisions. It is impressive the amount of time and effort those folks are spending on it. It's just really good work because of this slide, because we're getting so tight. We have no room for error when it comes to system operations these days. Next slide. All right, so this is showing what goes on with traditional capacity, and that's what you're looking at when it comes to the megawatts here, mainly driven by variable energy resources. Okay, that's what's driving our traditional. So we're going to ask a lot. So that's the peak. You can see when the peaks come up, when the variable energy generation is lowest. So that'd be solar at night, maybe when the wind's not blowing, those type of times. And you can see just the extreme ramping that we require of our conventional fleet these days. That's something we have to talk about. That's something we have to consider. I'm going to have some slides about the generation assessment process for outages, but we're asking our fleet, our conventional fleet, our entire fleet to do things that we've never had to because of the changes of fuel mix. And those are the attributes that we need to be careful that we keep because there's always things that are necessary on the system. You know, I joke with Casey quite a bit. They do a lot of system intact work in long-term planning. And and he's worked in system operations too, so he knows. But I would love to see the day that what system intact looks like, because we never have that. We always have outages. We always have things to deal with, and we just need to be sure that we're planning appropriately and giving ourselves room for that. Next slide, Casey. And this is showing similar information, just a broader timeline over the summer, where you can see the peaks, where we set our peak. Net load. So what net load is in this graph, and what you'll hear talked about from us for sure, and most across the footprint, is when you include your variable energy wind for us against your load. So we would call that net load that we have to serve ultimately, and that's what we're showing with the purplish area. And as net load gets really close to the peak or the load, meaning we have less wind, those are challenging days. You know, high wind days are challenging from a system congestion perspective. I know you guys have heard lots of statistics and stories about, you know, the megawatts that we have to curtail, and the RCs, the reliability coordinators, are very busy on those days. So those will be days where there's a lot of white space there, where we have a large amount of variable energy. And then the balancing operators will get really busy on the days where those numbers get pretty tight. Meaning variable energy is lower than expected. So those are the challenging conditions. You can see the variability. You know, it's not uncommon for us to ramp up thousands of megawatts, to ramp down thousands of megawatts, to back up thousands of megawatts within days, you know, a couple of days period. It really impresses me what we consider to be an average day. If you would have told me, and Casey will probably smile because I think he would be similar here, 5 years ago even, that I would call an average day what I call it today, I wouldn't have believed you. We are able to do normal operations and handle some very significant swings in our fleet, and it's just normal operations. And that's a testament to a ton of great work by our stakeholders, SPP staff, plant operators. We do have a really good area to operate in that I'm very thankful for. And I think my last slide, or next to last slide before I get into GAP, is the VA load, the peak conditions here. I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about this. I really just wanted to show, like, what we get this question quite a bit. What does it look like on a peak day? What was wind? And you can see we put wind forecast on here. We do pretty well with wind forecasting. That's a question we get quite frequently. You know, how good is your wind forecast? We've worked with our vendor, and we do pretty well with wind forecasting. We have what's called an icing forecast, and that's a bit of a misnomer because it includes cold weather cutout and some other things. We have a high-speed tripping forecast that comes in with that, and it works pretty well. And it really is a testament to how we're able to operate. The best you can predict those things, the better you can pre-position and be ready for them. So a really important part. But this is just a look at our peak day to show some of the challenges. And then, of course, what prices look like. That's important. We don't manage price. That's not what SPP does. We're not sitting there trying to set a specific price, but we are aware that it matters. And we do watch that from more of an analytical perspective. So we showed the MEC there, the marginal energy cost on the slide. All right, Casey, getting into the GAP process. So the generation assessment process, and this is really, in my mind, one of the newest things we're starting to talk about is this ability to take outages, and how that, in my opinion, we're looking probably at a reliability attribute that somehow focuses on that ability. And you have to remember that I pick a bit on ELCC and KC and averages and those type of things, but I do understand that for longer term processes, you do have to make some of those type of assumptions. In real-time system operations, we have to prepare for the minimums. We have to prepare for the worst case, right? I mean, we don't get to serve average load. So the gap process is something we stood up about 3 years now when we started seeing, we had never seen it before, where we had to worry about an overall capacity. We had so much extra that it wasn't an issue. We started seeing that we were just approving too many outages from an overall capacity perspective. The transmission system was okay, which is, as Casey mentioned, the traditional view of outages. It was fine. The transmission system could support it, but from a capacity perspective, because maybe variable energy wasn't there, that type of thing, we got ourselves in kind of a tight spot, and we started this process. Now, it's a great process, and here's some details about how it runs, what we look at, but really it's centered around that determination of looking into the forward view, what can we allow? That is becoming really difficult when the fleet becomes more variable to determine next month, right? What do we anticipate for when? We have that information, but I can tell you the error on that information is much, much greater than next week, than tomorrow. So how do we approve outages when it's almost anybody's guess 6 months out? How do you approve an outage if the fleet becomes 80, 90% renewable and you've got a little bit of conventional there? Will we ever let it go out? Can we ever let it go out? Well, we know that we can say no to the outage, right? We can say no to the planned maintenance, but all you're doing is forcing it into an emergency situation where it has a forced outage, and then you have more damage to equipment. We really need to work to define that and be prepared to be able to take outages. It is a very important part of what we have to do. It's not a want to do. We have to take outages, and as the system becomes less load following predictable, in the different horizons, that's one of the issues that we're starting to really focus more on. Yeah, I think we got a question. Leo, I'm sorry, you're on mute if you were trying to ask a question. I do see you.
I'm sorry, there, how's that? As you showed the ramping up and down, and you said over 3 days it can go by thousands of megawatts. And a lot of the dispatchable equipment is getting older now. So have you guys looked across the footprint at what toll this is taking on equipment? Can you actually predict outages or frequency of outages based on the fact that the ramping starting to take a maintenance toll on equipment?
We work really closely with our ORWG, our Operations Reliability Working Group, and others, and we do watch for forced outage rate. We're not seeing a big, because that's where I would expect to see most of that uptick. We're not seeing a big uptick, but we are concerned about the issue, and we do work closely with our stakeholders on that, because ultimately the plant operators are the ones in the know on that. I mean, we do have our role as the overall system operator. We need to rely on them. And we are being told that there's more planned maintenance needed, right? There's more maintenance needed as you're ramping, starting, stopping more, those type of things we are being told about, which is really driving the pressure even more into this, which is maybe the point of your question. We are hearing that there are requirements for more outages, more frequent outages, because of the increase in start-stops, the ramping. We do hear that, but we're not seeing a big uptick in forced outage, but it is a concern.
Even the planned maintenance, I mean, they may catch it in time to not take a forced outage, but even the planned maintenance, does it get more complex and more severe? Are they able to trend that at all?
Yeah, I can't speak to the severity, but I can tell you that it gets more frequent. That I know, that the more start-stops, the more ramping, the more times you turn off and open valves, shut valves, all those type of things drive that. Last slide, Casey, is just this is similar to a reservation system, is how we do it. First come, first served. This is a little dated. I pulled this back in December, but you can see that we currently at that point didn't have maintenance margin available for what is the traditional shoulder month of the spring. You can see it was already zero, and that is getting to be more and more common. There's just not as much room for outages in those areas. So you can see as this trend continues, right? we've shown you a ton of information today, but all the information we've showed is driving to where what we're currently seeing is going to be more, right? You're going to see more renewables. You're going to see more conventional retirements. That's what Casey showed. That's what the data is telling us. Then these numbers are going to continue to decrease. There's going to be less and less room for outages. That, Casey, that is my last slide. And just with a few minutes left, I just want to open it up for just questions in general.
Yeah, I know there was a number of market questions. I know we only have a couple of minutes left. Just maybe spend 1 minute on that, and CJ, I'd like your opinion on that. But it's just in general, I think there's a question around whether the markets are incentivizing the right behavior. CJ had that slide for the marginal energy costs. We've seen overall marginal energy costs exceed 10% of the hours in a year go negative. There's a distortion in the market because of the sheer amount. Basically, wind is competing against wind. It is driving prices down, which is good from a load perspective, but it doesn't incentivize dispatchable resources to stick around. And so something that we're doing is exploring generation attribute requirements per load responsible entity. So basically add additional criteria. We talked about expected unserved energy, but we may require a certain level of ramp per load responsible entity, which may necessitate, again, fuel type agnostic, but gas is kind of what we have today. There could be other technologies that could be able to provide that ramp. So we are working towards that. But in general, LMP based markets are not exactly incentivizing long-term capacity behavior. And so we're seeing that there's a number of activities in the market roadmap to be able to best change pricing formation based on some of the distortions I just mentioned. But we're kind of trying to think bigger than that and make sure that load responsible entities have what they need to work with their states to modify their resource plans for reliable operation.
Casey, can I just tack on to that? I assume what you're talking about is really the ancillary services market and the products that I think you've got a ramp product out there. You've added a market uncertainty product. Let me know, are there other products? And then the second part of that question is, it sounds like you're not real bullish on those products as far as solving our resource adequacy challenges. And it sounds like what you're talking about is, let's focus much more on our construct of what we require of LREs rather than just sitting back and creating new market products and hoping those will, over time incentivize the right generation mix. Well, I guess answer both of those questions. Did I miss any ancillary services products? And then am I kind of correct in how I'm interpreting how you view the relative importance of those versus RA requirements?
Yes, you're 100% correct. We do also provide regulation up, regulation down, spinning and supplemental contingency reserves as well. We did add the ramp and uncertainty product, but my understanding, the ramp only clears around $12 a megawatt hour on average, which is not anywhere close to incentivizing thermal generation to be added to the generation interconnection queue, for instance. So you are correct on the other question or assumption that we'd like to figure out what better longer term rules that we could put in place that provides better incentives for the long-term capacity changes that we're seeing. And if it's other technology and net zero carbon technology or dispatchable technology, that would be great too.
Yeah, Commissioner French, one comment I would make. I mean, energy, right? That's of course the big one. But what we've seen, and this is economic theory across all markets, we're not seeing the ability to maintain the broader, bigger economic benefits of keeping a plant online or new generation. I think it's a huge piece to the puzzle, and we don't need to lose track of that. The economic incentives are great, but that's where the requirements need, in my opinion, come in to back up the reliability needs. And then when it makes sense to clear those requirements in the market, I think that's fantastic. But it's really the requirements that are going to drive the necessity of the generation. And we're just not seeing enough of the value in these real-time markets and all the different products to support, because it's big dollars. I mean, these are not small dollars. And the other thing I'll mention that I always like to talk about when it comes to markets, those are lagging indicators. Okay, so when you set price and price gets set and you turn the lights off, you get to affect that later, but ultimately in the moment, the price didn't do anything for that moment. So it's a lagging indicator where we really need to be on the leading side, which of course in my position should say, because we're getting to deal with it.
Because you mentioned, the incentives just aren't there with an energy market. I don't want you to get political here, but I do kind of compare to Texas and the energy only market they had, and sort of, I think to a large degree, there was a thought that scarcity pricing, in these events, somehow generators would see that off in the future and they'd build plants knowing that they were going to have this big payday, and it just didn't work out that way. And I guess, I'll just say, I think we have the luxury here of, with fully vertically integrated utilities, we've got levers to pull to require them to keep resources and not just hope that the market compensates them eventually. I mean, can you add any color to that? I mean, is that generally, you view that as a positive for our region?
I definitely do, for my seat.
Yeah, I do too. I think we have the tools and the membership and the state commissions to solve this problem, but it is a complicated problem.
Well, I just think it's a cart before the horse, chicken or the egg. I mean, I think we need to be careful here and choose wisely. But I don't think this conversation can be avoided and much longer. And I think it needs to be a robust conversation, and sooner the better. So I'm looking at Commissioner French when I say that. I'm serious. I think this needs to start now in a real direct way.
Casey or CJ, I've got a few more questions to ask. You can kind of choose from between you which ones you'd care to ask to answer. I'm a little bit confused here. Some of us don't have exactly the steady diet of SPP related matters that Commissioner French has. So for those of us who don't, including myself, I'm a little bit confused, CJ, going back to one of your last comments on that last slide with an overview I think you're providing here is that we're going to have more renewables and less room for error. Did I understand that correctly?
Well, so I made a couple of comments about less room for error, and I wouldn't necessarily tie that to more renewables. The last slide I was talking about, as we get more renewables where it's not as predictive, right, late in the future, like what is wind or solar going to be next month? That's really hard to predict. When an entity comes and says, hey, I want to take a gas plant out or a coal plant out, and we look and we say, okay, let's see if we've got enough backup generation. That's what that last graph was showing, that that ability to say yes to the outage is dependent on what else we can get the BA's hands on. And as that becomes less predictable, we're going to project the minimum conditions we see around the time. Now, we're not going to put it at zero. We're not going to assume, the lowest it's ever been. We do a very robust analysis around it. But ultimately, as that becomes more uncertain, you don't have any choice but to be prepared for the minimum conditions. That's what I was talking about on the last slide.
Okay, because my concern would be, why not more thermal or dispatchable for reliability? That's my concern.
Well, again, SPP doesn't get to choose the fuel type. So that's where it's really critical that we define the attributes and where we can stay agnostic, where I think batteries is a huge part of the story that we can tell going forward. But if we define the attributes right, and then the stakeholders can go out and pick whatever fuel they want that meets the attributes, That's our role, because again, SPP is not in a position to be able to tell somebody they have to build a gas or have to build a coal or have to build, a nuke in this country. That's very challenging. That's not our role. We don't make those kinds of decisions. We have to work with our stakeholders and provide them the requirements necessary to then decide what gets built.
Battery technology is more perspective than present, is it not?
Say that your first part of that kind of broke
I say
up for me.
battery
What was it?
technology is more perspective than present in terms of filling in some of these. Is that not correct?
Correct.
Let me, there's one subject I think we need to touch on before we close, which is kind of the large animal in the table that we've referred to tangentially, but not as directly as I would prefer. And that's Winter Storm Uri and its aftermath, especially given the role of SPP as the grid operator. Can you give us a kind of a high level, some of the details about the policies that have changed since Winter Storm Uri to avoid a repetition of that?
Yeah, CJ, feel free to chime in, but one of my slides, and again, we can share the slide deck, but the performance-based accreditation will help directly support Winter Storm Uri events. Also, the winter PRM itself. So establishing a separate winter PRM that is also enforceable with deficiency payments is another aspect. We've done a number of, I guess I would say, smaller policy responses, such as ensuring that when we do perform load shed, it doesn't actually impact critical loads, or it doesn't. You would think that that's intuitive, but we did find some issues with that particular winter storm. It was such a multi-day large event that impacted so many other entities. We are also enhancing our interregional processes and planning processes for additional transfers and consideration for that, because importing 6 gigawatts from MISO and PJM was extremely helpful during Winter Storm Uri. And if you go back to 2018, MISO needed some help. 2014, PJM needed some help. So from a planning collaborative and the Eastern Interconnection, we're enhancing those particular processes. CJ may have some more I know we've done a lot of work in the gas electric coordination space. So there are a number of activities that we've already passed in preparation for the next event.
Yeah, I just add a couple of things. We've certainly done quite a bit of communication work where things that were stumbling blocks in Uri, probably more thought of tactical than I would consider in policy. Quite a bit of that activity that went on that we saw benefits from in Elliott. The biggest thing we've done, in my opinion, is change the PRM. That's the biggest thing, to be better prepared to ensure that we keep those megawatts on the grid that we've seen the retirements. That was huge in moving to the point. The IRATF, the Improved Resource Availability Task Force, has a litany of items that are still out there that are in response to Uri. Now, all of them clearly haven't been implemented yet, but certainly a laundry list of things that would improve, and we're working towards. It is very complex. There is a price tag, right? If at the end of the day, I don't think anybody's comfortable with zero risk, and you honestly can't get to zero, no matter how much money you spend. There's always going to be a risk of shedding load. And I do understand that this is not great news to hear, but it's a tool that has to be used with the system operators. We had a TOP, a transmission operator, have to shed load, not in your state, in another one, this event in Elliott. So there are times system operators have to turn the lights off to keep the greater good afloat. And that's just a part of it. And we have to figure that out. We have to figure out where that risk line is that everybody is comfortable with. And what I've seen is as you get away from an event, people get more comfortable with more risk when they start seeing the price tags. And then when you're in the event like Uri, there's really no amount of money. So we just got to have that good, and I appreciate your directness of the question, and we got to have a direct conversation about that. And we got to be, transparent about what we're seeing and be aware that the price tag on the other side is going to affect the ratepayers. I mean, there's no other way around it. I mean, that's what's going to have to happen.
Okay.
Second part of my question.
Go ahead.
The second part of my question has to do with, all right, I hear all these things you're putting in place. what are the major steps that are left to be undertaken to protect the grid going forward? The major steps that have not been taken that need to be taken. I know you've prioritized all these things, but there've got to be some major steps that are down the way that are yet to be undertaken. That was my question.
Yeah, so a lot of that we've kind of put in the scope of that REAL team that reports to the Regional State Committee, but establishing the expected unserved energy is really important. CJ mentioned the prioritization of generation attributes. I believe we've identified 7 critical generation attributes, but we've stacked them, and energy and ramp is by far the 2 generation attributes we need. And so ramp is another one established in that particular policy. So we do intend on establishing these criteria this year. It may need governing language that extends into the 2024 timeframe, but we are acting in such a way that with corporate risk or urgency to these particular elements. From my perspective, those are kind of the key items to better prepare for future extreme conditions.
I thought that your slides were really good at about a 60,000 foot level because it provides a tremendous overview and it provides context. I'm not trying to criticize your slides in the slightest. I'm a more granular person. I'm looking for, I'm kind of results oriented. I come from the business sector and the private sector. So that's what drives these questions that I'm asking you. I have one more question and my questions are at an end. And again, you can choose whoever chooses to answer. I want to know really if you can give me some idea about how is resource adequacy within SPP affected by the proposed expansion of SPP to the west and into Canada? And will this expansion impose additional costs upon existing SPP states?
So if you're talking about RTO West, right? Specifically the membership expansion. Yeah. So we've yet to determine exactly how that impacts the resource adequacy. But from our experience in a larger footprint as the program operator in the West, and also the fact that we will have 3 of the 7 DC ties for RTO West expansion, there is some level of transfer across those DC ties, but from a planning reserve margin and resource adequacy perspective, that RTO West footprint may have its own separate PRM, which means that, the region in the East may it wouldn't impact you negatively, but it probably won't impact you positively either. Now, take that with a grain of salt because we have to do some additional evaluation and study, and there's also a notion of expansion of those ties, which would increase the size of the pipe such that ideally everyone would benefit from a larger footprint. Now, the second question is based on the overall RTO. It would be effectively net beneficial, similar to when IF would join. So from an overall economies of scale and what we'd actually have to put in place for that RTO West expansion, the cost at which for that expansion far is reduced by the overall net benefit now we would provide. Now, there's a lot more to that would have to be, kind of unpacked from that regard, but that's the intent. And I think my understanding is it's around 10% increase in load.
If I could add just an editorial comment, because I can say things that maybe you can't. I mean, I would, Commissioner Keen, I would sort of count myself still in the bucket of skeptics on what the value proposition is to the east of the West joining. It's not to say that I have any problem with SPP's pursuit out there as long as we aren't negatively impacted. Although I have my questions about, we all have finite resources and how much of those are going toward the Western expansion. So I'm going to put myself in that bucket of skeptic on what the value proposition is. But I will say the one area that I'm interested in is I think the final area Casey raised, which is more on the resource adequacy piece. And I think we did see, the ability to drop our planning reserve margin if maybe 10 years ago now has happened as SPP grew its footprint and the ability to draw on resources over a larger geographic area, especially as we see these extreme events that are, weather is localized, and the bigger the area you have, maybe the entire footprint is not affected. And so I'm willing to entertain that could actually be a substantial benefit in the future if there was interconnectedness with a larger footprint. But that's something that I think is going to have to be borne out with a lot of analysis over the next several years. So I just wanted to make sure that, you know, I share some of that skepticism, but I'm willing to be open that I think reliability, if there's anything that could tip the scales to me of the benefits, I think reliability is a potential benefit.
And again, Casey,
Yeah.
the high level impact, I'm sorry, with the high level impact with respect to Canada with the addition of the 2 Canadian provinces. Did you hear me?
Are you
Is that
talking?
a question?
That was a question
Okay.
directed to Casey or CA.
So that adding British Columbia, that's a contract service, so that wouldn't impact. In fact, it helps reduce the rate at which Kansas ratepayers pay. That's actually a contract service, so it's not our tariff. So going all the way to Seattle, that's more of a net benefit for the Western interconnection, but it does help offset the overall fees in which Kansas pays.
In Manitoba.
So that's the same thing in terms of the Manitoba Hydro, same thing.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Just real quick, I think it's an important driver because there's a lot to be determined in the West. But one thing to keep in mind is we will operate a separate balancing authority in the West, which will drive a very separate approach. So I think that's an important piece to keep in mind. There's a whole bunch of check boxes and line items, but it's not on the table. It's not physically possible to combine the BAs, which drives a lot in what you were asking about. Sorry, Chair Duffy.
Okay, no, that's fine. I'm glad because the whole issue of the West expansion, I would agree. I think that the case will have to be made. I did have a quick question on Storm Uri. Did we take all that we could from MISO so that we didn't have to shed load? And if we didn't, why not? And secondly, was it more expensive for that load to be used from MISO into the SPP region?
Yeah, so we took quite a bit of emergency power during Uri from not only MISO, but every neighbor around us. And we received imports in excess of 6,000 megawatts on top of what I'm talking about, to the point where our system couldn't take any more. So I'm very confident that we took all the megawatts we could take in any number of ways during Winter Storm Uri because of we had emergency power in place from MISO. As far as the price goes, honestly, during those situations, I couldn't tell you because it didn't impact the decision. When we're shedding load, you know, we're directed per the NERC standards that at any price we have to go out and procure. I honestly do not know. You know, I know some of the contracts that drive those pricing, but I couldn't tell you if it was cheaper or more expensive. I don't personally know.
Yeah, I just wanted to know the review process if we were price gouged or if there's some memorandum of understanding that in an emergency it comes across at whatever it was there in the home base.
Sure. Yeah. So it's important to know that all of our neighboring agreements that drive that have a predetermined section that determines price both ways. Yeah. So that's a known price. Sometimes it's based on an interface that can fluctuate, but it's a known price that we've agreed to as part of our neighboring agreements.
Okay.
Yeah, in our joint operating agreements. And I did want to add, just for context, when CJ says 6,000 megawatts of import, any given operating hour, the most that we ever see in the bilateral market for importing power from MISO or the rest of the Eastern Interconnection is typically anywhere from 500 to 1,500 megawatts. So when CJ says, based on Winter Storm Uri, you're talking more than 4 times a typical operating hour. So we were able to that greatly helped.
Absolutely. It sounds like it. Okay. It is past time. I'm looking at the board here. I don't see anybody else who has unmuted to ask a question, but I will go back to Commissioner French, Commissioner Keen, and our staff. Is there anything else? Not hearing it.
None from me. Thank you.
Thank you. I do want to thank you. This is extremely important for us. Like Commissioner Keen said, Commissioner French is front and center on a lot of this. We aren't. And so to be able to touch base and on this very important issue of resource adequacy and to understand how we're going forward through the SPP, I think is important for us. I think you've raised some up here at the very end, energy and ramping. I would like to better understand what staff's thoughts are on the ramping portion, because I think therein is a key to solving a problem. But anyway, I want to thank both of you, Casey and CJ, for taking the time and being here. And Kim, it was so good to see you as well. And this is a major component of our discussion on resource adequacy, and it will continue. But thank you very, very much. So
thank you all. So great to be here. And
if there's nothing else, I will close today's meeting. And again, hope to see you later on a future discussion. Everyone stay well, be warm today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.